Hi, I'm Nadia, and welcome to Hidden History, where I'm exploring some stories about World War II that you may not have heard before. Today, I'm going to tell you about the incredible escape of tens of thousands of Polish women and children from Stalin's Gulag. After invading Poland in September 1939, the Soviets began arresting 1.7 million people living in East Poland, and they deported them to thousands of miles into the Soviet Union. There were four main waves of deportations. The first was on the 10th of February in 1940, when they targeted military veterans, police, and other officials who were capable of organising a resistance to occupation. Whole families were deported to some of the most notorious labour camps in the north and east of Siberia. The second, on the 13th of April, targeted the families of Polish officers who had fought to defend Poland during the invasion. And since my father had been an officer in the Polish army, this was when my grandmother Maria and my three uncles were arrested. Most of the people arrested in April were women and children, and they were sent to work on collective farms in Kazakhstan. In June 1940 and 1941, there were two further deportations to mop up people the Soviets had missed in the first two waves. My family lived in a village near Drohobych, which came under the administrative district of Lvov. My grandfather died before the war, leaving his wife Maria as head of the household. This photo, probably taken in the early 1930s, shows my dad in the foreground and his mother Maria participating in celebrations of Poland's Constitution Day on May 3rd. In 1940, Maria had been warned that a deportation was imminent, but she adamantly refused to give up the land she had worked for all her life to go into hiding. And even if she had done so, I think she would probably have been deported on a later roundup. So she and her three sons, Ludwig, Mikhail, and Józef, stood their ground on their farm. NKVD, or secret police officers, came with armed soldiers in the dead of night. They were told to pack, but had no idea where they were being taken. Maria had another son, Tomasz, who lived across the street in the same village. And a poignant aspect of her story is that Maria was allowed to say goodbye to him, and she gave him her sheepskin coat to look after while she was away. So clearly she had no idea that she was being sent to a place where the temperature that winter would fall to minus 40 degrees, or that she would never see Tomasz or her home again. Just like that, everything she had ever worked for was taken away from her. At the time of her arrest, Maria was 68 years old. My grandmother Maria was taken to the nearest railway station, and there she was separated from her sons, who were sent to hard labour camps in Siberia. I'll tell you what happened to them in another video. Women and children were packed into boxcars like the one in this photograph. They were usually used to transport cattle, and they were very overcrowded with about 70 people to each car. There was no sanitation on board, only a hole in the floor for a toilet. According to the Russian Railway Authority, 4 trains departed Lvov on the 13th of April 1940. They were all bound for Kazakhstan. Across all of East Poland, a staggering 320,000 people, mainly women and children, were deported to Kazakhstan on that day alone. According to survivors' accounts, they travelled like this for weeks, while on board the prisoners worried about their loved ones. Would they ever see each other again? And where were they being taken? The train stopped only every few days to allow people to stretch their legs and receive water, bread, and soup. Children and the sick died en route, their bodies left by the railway tracks. The Kazakh Steppe is a vast expanse of open land. During Stalin's rule, so many different ethnic groups were deported to Kazakhstan as slave labourers that they outnumbered the Kazakh citizens. After leaving the trains, the Polish women and children were taken on trucks and ox carts to collective farms or kolkhots, like the one pictured on the left. I can imagine arriving at this desolate location and losing all hope of ever being able to find my way back home. The poor Kazakh peasants living in these remote settlements of primitive mud huts were forced to share their modest homes with the incoming deportees. So the huts were grossly overcrowded and everyone's clothing quickly became infested with body lice. The deportees had to earn their keep on the farm, sowing and harvesting grain and other crops, and also tending livestock, all relying on primitive manual labour. These farms were state-owned, and everything they produced was taken by the Soviet administrators. The workers received meagre earnings, with which they could purchase a little food: bread, eggs, flour, and milk. Women with children to support faced a daily struggle to survive, and they couldn't afford to fall ill and not work. If they were lucky, other families shared their rations, and because of this, the farms were more survivable than the hard labour camps of Siberia. But still, many people died here, most of them children, especially from infectious diseases. According to survivors' accounts, the Polish women on the collective farms were aware from Russian newspapers that Germany had invaded Russia in June 1941, and that the Polish government had signed an agreement with Stalin to release Gulag prisoners to form an army that would fight against Hitler. In January 1942, these troops began relocating south out of Russia, across Kazakhstan, to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Some of the Poles who had been deported to collective farms in Kazakhstan also received release papers and identification documents permitting them to leave the farms and join the trains going south, which I've shown with these arrows here. Miraculously, Maria, who was now 69 years old, was one of them. And also travelling on these same trains south were two of her sons, Mikhail and Yusuf, who had also survived their ordeal. This journey to Tashkent was over 1,200 miles and lasted at least 6 days. And although the climate in Tashkent was less severe than in Russia, the Polish evacuees there were struck by epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and malaria, and there were no medical provisions available to treat them. Because the death toll was so high, the Poles were evacuated to safety in Iran, where they came under the care of the British administration, and this involved a second long journey west to a port on the Caspian Sea called Turkmenbashi. In order to reach the trains that were crossing Kazakhstan, the women and children had to walk long distances from their collective farms without maps in order to find a railway station. You can imagine from these photographs the huge distances that were involved. Not easy to do with small children, and where were they to get food and water? More than 20,000 children made this journey, many of them orphans. When they did find a railway station, they might have to sleep on the platforms for days before a train even arrived. But once on board the trains, they were able to get rations whenever the train stopped. A representative from each carriage would then gather up people's ration cards to collect bread and soup from a kiosk on the station platform. But sometimes the train started unpredictably before they could rejoin the train, and this meant that some parents were separated from their children, and some people lost their ration cards. Although this journey was long and arduous, these people were in high spirits to be released from captivity. Still, it is a tale of remarkable resilience that they were able to survive. When they arrived at the seaport of Turkmenbashi, the refugees boarded an assortment of cargo ships to cross the Caspian Sea. These included coal barges and oil tankers. Not designed to carry passengers, these ships had no facilities to provide food or water, and the few toilets on board were woefully inadequate for the number of passengers, many of whom had dysentery or diarrhea and were unable to control their bowel movements. Most people tried to relieve themselves over the side of the ship. There are some pretty graphic descriptions of the appalling conditions on these ships online. People continued dying during this 5-day sea crossing, and their bodies were thrown overboard into the sea. So this is how the Polish evacuees finally reached safety in Iran. When they arrived at the port of Pahlavi in Iran, the receiving authorities were taken aback by the number and physical condition of the refugees. The Red Cross had set up tents to accommodate the Poles, and their new living quarters were luxury compared to the Soviet Union. There was a hospital where the sick, especially those with typhus, received medical care, although few of them survived. People suspected of having typhus were quarantined and separated from the rest. The new arrivals had their heads shaven and were deloused. All clothes infested with lice were burned, and new clothes were provided. There was an abundance of food, generously provided by the Iranians, but the Poles had to start slowly with soup, which was easy for them to digest. These are some of the thousands of Polish orphans who were rescued from the Soviet Union. And the boy standing here in the centre looked after his baby sister standing in front of him after both of their parents died in the Gulag. As for my grandmother Maria, her determination to overcome this terrible ordeal and regain her freedom is an inspiration to me. Sadly, her newfound freedom lasted less than 6 months. As far as I know, she was never reunited with her sons Yusuf and Mikhail, who also managed to reach safety in Iran, but they were enlisted in the army and they were sent to military camps in Tehran. According to the Polish Red Cross, Maria died in hospital in August 1942, having been diagnosed with a deep vein thrombosis in her leg. I presume that a clot must have reached her lungs or her heart and killed her. I wonder if her condition was caused by the many days of sitting on overcrowded trains and on board the ship during her exodus. She was buried in a Polish cemetery in Parlewy, which to this day is tended and cared for by complete strangers in Iran. Not a single member of my family has so far managed to visit her grave, but one day I hope to make that journey so that she can know that she has been found and is not forgotten. My father was notified of her death in 1943 while he was stationed in England, and I found this letter neatly folded in its envelope among his personal effects after he died. He never said a word to me about the awful trauma to which his family had been subjected, all because he was an officer in the Polish army. I hope you learned something new from this video. Please give me a like below and subscribe to my channel so you can check out my other videos. And thank you again for watching.